Abraham Lincoln and the emancipation of black slaves in the United States. The abolition of slavery or the emancipation of black slaves is an important part of the history of the United States. Therefore, to understand the emancipation of black slaves, we must put this type of work in a historical context, where conflicts resulting from economic, political and racial interests became the center of the history of the United States. Emancipation process which freed black slaves, but the fight for racial equality between whites and blacks which still persists at this time. Historically, we all know that slavery refers to the legal institution that existed in the United States of America during the 18th and 19th centuries, in which millions of black Africans were part of the productive apparatus, considered not as humans but as a work tool, mostly the plantations, which demanded a lot of labor to work in the countryside of the southern states. Slavery was practiced in British America from the beginning of the colonial era, in 13 colonies in the northwest part of the American territory, surrounded by the waters of the Atlantic, and was firmly established when the United States Declaration of Independence was signed. President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1, 1863, as the nation approached its third year of bloody civil war. The proclamation declared that all persons held as slaves within the rebellious states are, and henceforth shall be, free. Although Lincoln had announced the Emancipation Proclamation 2 years earlier, freedom did not come for most African Americans until the Union victory in April 1865 and, officially, in December 1865 with the ratification of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. Approximately 40,000 slaves remaining in Kentucky were freed by this amendment. The country was founded by British settlers who arrived in the east of the country in the 17th century. Slavery was already allowed in the 13 British colonies. Slaves who arrived in the country from Africa were violently captured and transported to the American continent on slave ships. Many lost their lives along the way due to hunger and disease that spread on the ships. The Africans traveled in piles, as if they were merchandise. In the United States, black slaves were bought to work mainly on agricultural plantations of rice, tobacco or cotton, which would become an important product. Between 1775 and 1783 the War of Independence took place, which ended the relationship between Great Britain and its colonies and the creation of the United States. In 1787 the Constitution of the United States would be signed. In the text, although the word slavery was not mentioned openly, it was supported. In 1861 the American Civil War broke out. The United States was divided into different regions, and the southern states, which were in favor of slavery, united to form the Confederate States. They wanted to become independent from the rest, who were increasingly opposed to slavery, and form their own country. The northern states joined together to form the Union. They expired in 1865. President Abraham Lincoln, in the midst of conflict, approved the Emancipation Proclamation. It came into effect in 1863 to free slaves in the Confederate States. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, people were kidnapped from the African continent, sold to the colonies in America through the transatlantic slave market, forced into slavery in the American colonies, and exploited to work as servants and labor in the production of crops such as tobacco and cotton. In the mid-19th century, America's westward expansion and the abolition movement sparked a huge debate over slavery that would tear the nation apart in the bloody Civil War, resulting in the end of slavery in the United States of America. 12 million Africans were sent to America between the 16th and 19th centuries. Of these, an estimated 645,000 were sent to what is now known as the United States. The largest number were transported to the Caribbean and Brazil, where life expectancy was short and slaves had to be constantly replaced. Life expectancy was much higher in the United States, generally because of better food, less illness, less work, and better medical care, so the numbers grew rapidly, with the number of births exceeding the number of deaths. The slave population in the United States had grown to 4 million according to the 1860 census. It must be taken into account that among the aberrations produced by slaveholders there was also the obligation to procreate among slaves on the part of their owners. This arose from the idea that a strong woman with a strong man gave birth to a strong black child, a new slave. But this also created the conditions in which the black woman's womb was exploited by slave owners to make their profits in the market, creating what some call a black slave breeding farm. Most slaves were owned by plantation owners, who are defined by historians as those who own 20 or more slaves. 95% of black people lived in the South, representing a third of the population of that region. By comparison, in the North, black people only represented 2% of the population. Slave labor was a primary factor in the accumulation of wealth in the United States in the first half of the 19th century. On January 13, 1777, Prince Hall and 7 other black men petitioned the General Court of Massachusetts, on behalf of a large number of Negroes, insisting that they had a natural and inalienable right to liberty. The petitions demonstrate that black people in different parts of New England asserted an African identity during the American Revolution. Historians generally note this trend with African churches and societies at the turn of the century. In the mid-1780s, a complex mix of addressing blacks in the colony and then state authorities, bringing slaves lawsuits against the entire institution of slavery, and an increase in private manumissions derailed with the future of slavery in Massachusetts. Something that people should understand: Britain's colonial breakup did not end slavery in the southern states. Emancipation occurred in the northern states little by little and with great hesitation, even fear. Furthermore, abolition compensated northern slave owners, who did not guarantee citizenship to free blacks, and at least partially, which gave rise to a movement to send free blacks to Africa. In 1787, when nearly 300,000 people of African descent populated every state of the new nation, many leaders hoped that slavery would decline, as George Washington put it, little by little, slowly, surely, and imperceptibly. The hope was vain. Eventually, of course, slavery ended. But the cost of the delay was horrible. The document of the Founding Fathers consigned millions of human beings to chattel servitude. In the 78 years between the writing of the Constitution and the end of the Civil War, the United States became the preeminent slaveholding nation in the world, with a population at the time of emancipation, 3.9 million, than any other in history. Something that you can notice: slavery itself was never widespread in the North, although many of the region's businessmen became wealthy from the slave trade and investments in southern plantations. Between 1774 and 1804, all northern states abolished slavery, but the institution of slavery remained absolutely vital to the South. Historian James M. McPherson defines an abolitionist as someone who before the Civil War had agitated for the immediate, unconditional, and complete abolition of slavery in the United States. He does not include anti-slavery activists like Abraham Lincoln or the Republican Party, which called for the gradual end of slavery. Benjamin Franklin, a slaveholder for much of his life, became a leading member of the Pennsylvania Society for the Abolition of Slavery, the first recognized organization for abolitionists in the United States. After the American Revolutionary War, northern states abolished slavery, beginning with the Vermont Constitution of 1777, followed by Pennsylvania's gradual emancipation law in 1780. Other states with a greater economic interest in slaves, such as New York and New Jersey, also passed gradual emancipation laws, and by 1804 all northern states had abolished it, although this did not mean that existing slaves were freed. Some had to work without pay as indentured servants for 2 more decades, although they could no longer sell themselves. Also in the years after the Revolution, individual slaveholders, especially in the Upper South, manumitted slaves, sometimes at will. In the Deep South, manumission became difficult. In South Carolina, all manumission required legislative approval, and freed slaves had to leave the state immediately. On January 1, 1808, at St. Thomas African Episcopal Church in Philadelphia, the Reverend Absalom Jones gave his Thanksgiving sermon for the abolition of the African slave trade. Scholars have explained how Lincoln could emancipate the slaves less for his own sake than for the nation's sake. Yet, paradoxically, Lincoln's nation was also a slave nation. Many noted that they had been moved by the revolutionary ideals of the equality of men. The number of free blacks as a proportion of the black population increased from less than 1% to nearly 10% from 1790 to 1810 in the Upper South as a result of these actions. In 1793, Congress passed a law to enforce the fugitive slave provision of the Constitution, which guaranteed slave owners the right to claim their human property on the soil of free states. When Northern consciences resisted the measure in subsequent decades, Congress passed the notorious Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which historian Eric Foner has labeled the most powerful exercise of federal authority in the United States in the entire era before of the Civil War. People probably know the significance of January 1, 1863 as they do the significance of January 1, 1808. Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation and the North winning the Civil War 2 years later have left 1863 as the marker for the end of all slavery in the United States. Although the Emancipation Proclamation did not end slavery in the nation, it captured the hearts and imaginations of millions of Americans and fundamentally transformed the character of the war. After the proclamation was signed establishing the end of slavery and that it could not happen again, 3 amendments to the Constitution were adopted to clarify what the new status meant for former slaves, those of African descent, and other races, including some whites who had been under forced servitude. After the abolition of slavery, in some states and cities, especially in the South, Jim Crow laws were implemented to maintain segregation between whites and blacks. Their motto was separate but equal, but in practice it was a way of discriminating against the black population. Government positions and important jobs were reserved for whites. In addition, blacks had problems voting and could not mix with whites. Despite advances in equality, there are still differences between the black and non-Hispanic white populations in the United States.